Hello, I'm broadcasting from quarantine, awaiting the results of my second COVID test, and growing my apocalypse scruff. Now, as this is being written, it appears that Joe Biden has won the presidential election. Trump, of course, is claiming that Biden won through fraud, something that even Fox News has greeted with at least a tiny bit of skepticism. Trump even claimed, without evidence, that voter fraud occurred back when he won the election in 2016. Some of his supporters are echoing his claims, taking to social media to present, without evidence, claims of voter fraud. But, to be fair, there is a famous or infamous video by Project Veritas, which has been widely distributed and purports to show fraud. As this is being recorded, the Attorney General of Texas is investigating the matter. If fraud did occur, the perpetrator or perpetrators should definitely be punished, because attacking democracy is morally bad. As would be expected, the unsupported claims about fraud have been repeatedly debunked, but Trump and his supporters do persist in their claims. It is true that issues and problems do arise in any election, and that fraud does occur in some tiny fraction of a fraction of the votes. As such, arguments trying to prove that significant voter fraud exists tend to be fallacies or based on lies. One popular approach is the fallacy of anecdotal evidence. This involves emphasizing an example of real fraud and then taking the anecdote to counter the overwhelming statistical evidence that voter fraud is incredibly rare. But of course, voter fraud is not non-existent. It does occur, but in a tiny fraction. Somewhat ironically, the anecdotes often serve to better show that fraud is difficult and largely ineffective. The perpetrators of the examples used obviously have been caught, and any damage they did is typically addressed. For example, a North Carolina GOP operative, ironically enough, was charged with multiple felonies for ballot tampering in a 2018 election. The results were overturned. Now, the rhetorical tactic of hyperbole is also used, as are outright lies, such as claims made by Attorney General Barr. Now, willful misinterpretation is also a very common tactic. For example, it is true that a New Jersey postal worker did dump 99 general election ballots in a dumpster over the course of a few days. While this might seem to be a case of intentional election tampering, the worker dumped more than 1,800 pieces of mail. As such, the more reasonable explanation is that he was dumping the mail for some other reasons, and ballots happened to be a fraction of this mail. There was also a similar incident in which 3 trays of mail, apparently, were found in a ditch. There were some mail-in ballots in the mix, but the situation was, as one should expect, nothing like the claims made by Trump about ballots being dumped in rivers. Now, these mail issues are a problem, but they are not specifically a voter fraud problem. They are a problem with mail being dumped or lost. To use an anecdote of my own, some years ago, I get a Christmas card from my father that was 5 years late. And the reason why, when I got finally got the card, it was part of a, postal theft investigation. They weren't stealing ballots, they were engaged in, stealing mail. And that is clearly a problem. But to say that there is like a systematic effort of voter fraud, you would need more than postal workers happening to dump, as part of dumping lots of other mail, some ballots. Now, once again, these examples ironically show the system is working reasonably well. The mail was found, the matter investigated, the issue addressed. Trump and his supporters have generally eroded away all credibility in this matter. But this is not to say that their claims must be false. To infer that a claim about a fraud is false because it was made by Trump or a supporter who has lost credibility would be a mere ad hominem fallacy, saying that it's not true because of some alleged defect in the person making it. But Trump has no credibility, so it would be foolish to believe a claim simply because it was made by him. What would be needed is credible evidence of significant intentional efforts to engage in fraud or tamper with the election. So, how can the dispute over fraud be settled rationally? Now, suppose we were disputing the issue of which NBA player scored the most points in 2019. While people might have strong feelings about who is the best player, we would be able to easily settle this by going to a trusted source for the sports statistics, and the issue would be resolved by any psychotic person would accept, a legitimate source of, basketball statistics. Now, while voter and election fraud are also objective features of reality, in the sense that, we could check into them, there is probably no source trusted by both fraud claimers and fraud deniers. For example, if I refer to NPR, CNN, certainly not MSNBC, or academic studies, I will be greeted with cries of fake news, Marxist academics, so the matter cannot be addressed in this manner. What I will try to do is this: present a rational approach to addressing claims of fraud that does not require trusting news or academic sources, or sources that fraud claimers would say, fake Marxists. I mean, real Marxists they claim, but, fake news. Now, let's think about individual voter fraud. This is something that's very unlikely because it is a high-effort, low-return tactic that is typically a felony. To use an analogy, it's kind of like trying to get rich by robbing kids' lemonade stands with a gun. There is little return, it takes a lot of work, and the consequences, of course, are severe. That's a felony. And in some, maybe all states, it's that, laws about gun crimes involving guns, you get that 10, 20, life thing. Now, election tampering itself, we could say, is a better strategy. It's still evil, but better in the sense that it is a higher return on the effort, but is also high risk. Again, those activities are typically felonies, and they seem to be relatively easy to detect. There's also the fact that there are legal ways to shape the vote: voter suppression, voter expansion, gerrymandering, and such, all perfectly legal. These provide far greater return on effort, and again, are not illegal. You don't get arrested and charged with a felony for suppressing the vote through various legal means, by getting people to vote through voter expansion, again if it's done legally. And gerrymandering is perfectly legal. It's was well established. So this is why parties put their efforts into these strategies rather than engaging in low yield and high risk fraud. As such, in this current time, fraud organized by parties is unlikely, but of course not impossible. And we can of course refer to the past when fraud and so forth was a legendary thing, a legendary part of politics. At this point, Trump supporters are likely to insist that they do have evidence of voter and election fraud, pointing to various memes, websites, tweets, and videos. Again, disputing these sources would be pointless. If I say these are not, a meme is not credible, a tweet by just tweeted out of nowhere even by the president has no credibility, just random videos lack credibility. Of course, they're going to say back, you're just fake news, so we don't have, at this point, any objective shared reality, I suppose. But I guess we do have this. We can both agree, all of us agree, that voter fraud and election interference are crimes, typically felonies. If you, as a Trump supporter or non-Trump supporter, have evidence of such activity, you can tweet it, meme it, YouTube it, but you definitely should send it directly to law enforcement. And if you have doubts about the credibility of law enforcement, like in your area, thinking that they're, beholden to the Democrats, federal election crime is federal. bring it to the attention of other law enforcement you think you can trust. If you think you can't trust any law enforcement, then I guess, which some people don't, then I guess there's no way to resolve this. Now, if law enforcement finds it credible, they'll investigate it, one would hope. So if fraud or tampering did occur, then there's a good chance they will make arrests, and there will be trials. We've seen this happen. A good example being the GOP operative who was arrested and tried. As such, if there is real evidence of widespread voter fraud or election interference, then there should be follow-up police reports and court transcripts. To be totally fair, it can take a while for investigations to conclude. Our legal system is quite slow for a variety of reasons, so we have to wait a reasonable amount of time to allow for the legal evidence to surface. So I'm not going to say, there's no court evidence right now, there's no police reports right now, because there wouldn't be. This is something that takes time. But if real crimes were occurred on a large scale, we would expect that there would be arrests, there would be trials. So if you do believe that Biden, assuming he's won, this is still in dispute, won due to widespread voter fraud and have evidence for this, I look forward to seeing the police reports and court transcripts for these cases. Again, oddly, past claims of significant fraud and tampering made by Trump and many of his supporters lack such evidence. For example, back in 2016 when Trump won, he claimed that there were millions of people voting illegally because he lost the popular vote by a lot, which is the way the Electoral College can work. But he's never backed this up with evidence. If there are 3 million people who committed fraud, where are the arrest reports? Where are the court transcripts? Where are the criminals? Trump has had control of the executive branch for 4 years, and he commissioned a voter fraud commission, and his own commission didn't turn up any widespread fraud. So if there were 3 million people who voted fraudulently in 2016, and Trump knows this for a fact, why no arrests? Why no convictions? Why did even his own commission find nothing? And that's something that needs to obviously be explained. If someone claimed that Democrats are going around committing widespread murder, suppose Trump said, Democrats killed, 3 million people last year, you would expect to see police reports. You'd expect them to be, tried for murder, because murder is a crime. You'd expect to see that happening. Now, also, assuming Biden won, which again is not yet settled, for him to have won through fraud would have required a nationwide, coordinated conspiracy involving large numbers of people. It would have to occur under the very noses of election officials, media, citizens, and law enforcement. Such a vast conspiracy would create considerable evidence that should be readily available. If the absurd claim is made that Democrats are Machiavellian masters of intrigue who have duped the nation, then there seem to be two inferences from that claim. One is that if they are so competent, being sarcastic here, then perhaps they should be in charge. If they're that good at organizing things, we should probably hand the COVID situation over to them if they're that incredible, that masterful. Again, being sarcastic here. Political legitimacy comes from the vote of the majority, not from just being good at what one does, or good at doing bad things. The second is that if they are so capable at hiding evidence so that none is available, how does anyone know that they committed this miraculous crime? Where is the evidence? If there's no evidence, how can one say that they committed this crime? But if there is evidence, how can one say that they were these masterful, deceivers? At this point, a dedicated Trump supporter might bring up the shadow government, or, the deep state, a conspiracy theory that there is a secret government with a real power. The easiest and obvious replies are as follows. First, how could this be? Trump holds the executive branch and thus controls the military and the police. He also effectively controls many courts, like the Supreme Court. Republicans hold the Senate, most governorships, and most state legislatures. There does not seem to be much left for the deep state or shadow government to control. I mean, I love conspiracies. I wrote for a game called Dark Conspiracy. I write horror conspiracy game stuff. So, that idea is appealing, but that seems to be fiction. Second, if this deep state or shadow government or whatever you want to call it is so powerful and so inimical to Trump, then one must wonder, how has it allowed the Republicans to win so much? The more reasonable explanation is that Biden simply won, so he did win, by legitimately getting more votes. A final point when thinking about claims of voter or election fraud in 2020, consider this. It appears that the Democrats will lose some seats in the House. They'll still retain their lead, and the Republicans will keep their lead in the Senate. They will retain the majority, and thus they can do, under the leadership of Mitch McConnell, who won his re-election, they can do almost anything they want. This would be a very odd thing for Democrats to do if they use fraud to win the presidential election. After all, there are not separate ballots for the president and for other races. As such, the outcome of the election tells against fraud. Now, one could argue the Democrats are being super clever, just cheating on the presidential election, but playing it fair with all other races so no one suspects they're cheating. But this is obviously stupid. Trump was already accusing the Democrats of planning fraud. I mean, he accused them back in 2016 before, even though he won. And the Democrats, they can see Twitter, they can see him on the TV, and they knew that unless Trump won, they would be accused of fraud no matter what. And probably, as we saw in 2016, even if Trump won, he'd still accuse them of fraud. So if they're going to cheat, there'd be no reason not to cheat across the board and secure a majority in the Senate and gain more seats in the House. Now, you could make a case that they wouldn't cheat too openly, like if it was, sort of like a old Soviet-style election, 100% for Joe Biden, 100% for Democrats. You could argue that if they're going to cheat, they would, keep it plausible. But if they're going to cheat, it would be plausible, given all the polls, etc., that the Democrats would hold on to their lead in the House, and that they would, get to, say, 53 in the Senate. That would be plausible. Yeah, if they did like 100, you'd be like, yeah, clearly cheating, but getting to, say, 53, 54, 55, believable. So if they were going to cheat, there'd be no reason for them not to cheat all across the board. So in closing, while there is no evidence of widespread voter election fraud, I am willing to accept things like to have like a shared evidence between, fraud claimers and fraud deniers. I hope we can at least agree that law enforcement in the courts would at least be a possibly credible source. That if there are cases and evidence of widespread voter fraud and there's real evidence, that this would be given to law enforcement, they would investigate, we would have police reports, we'd have court documents, as we do in cases that are used as examples of real voter fraud that really occurred. We have arrest reports, we have court transcripts. Again, the GOP operative example I gave is a case where someone was arrested, you have arrest reports, you have court documents, you have credible evidence. So, I am always willing to accept credible documentation showing widespread voter fraud. And the police, law enforcement would be very interested in this as well because, as I've noted, voter fraud, election tampering are felonies. And if you've got the video, if you've got the evidence, then get that to law enforcement and they will presumably take it seriously. If you believe that the government is already ruled by the Democrats, then I guess the question would be, how did Trump even have power? So stay safe, beat the COVID, and I hope that I will see you in the future. If I don't see you in a better time, perhaps we'll meet again in a better place. So take care.